Now, back home, what does poverty mean? In this week's magazine, Leo McKinstry writes that the term is overused and co-opted by corporate brands. Leo joins me now along with Grace Blakeley, the commentator. Leo, Grace, thank you for coming on today. Leo, you write in your piece how the term poverty has taken on a new meaning. Can you explain?
Well, poverty is a genuine problem in Britain on a worrying scale, and it has been exacerbated by the pandemic. But I do think that my article shows how poverty is both being exaggerated by pressure groups. The incidence of poverty is being exaggerated by new definitions used by pressure groups in order to grab headlines and gain interest for their work, and also by big corporations that want to indulge in a bit of virtue signalling by associating themselves with the fight for social justice. And in both cases, I don't feel that there's a genuine concern for addressing real poverty in Britain, which of course exists, as I say, on a worrying scale. I live down near Margate, and of course I see poverty all the time around me. But I think the incidence of poverty is being exaggerated for political ends and for corporate ends. And there's so many examples of that. One of the most absurd is transport poverty, which the Royal Automobile Club, the RAC, define as if you spend more than 10% of your income on transport, you are in relative transport poverty, which is absurd, of course, because rich people do, by definition, spend more of their income on transport, whether it's on international travel or gas-guzzling cars, or more on petrol, or more expensive cars, or first-class train travel. And you end in the ridiculous situation that those who are defined in the biggest transport poverty are the very richest. The people who own maybe Rolls-Royce and Bentleys. Actually, the Rolls-Royce in the driveway is a badge of poverty, which shows how distorted statistics can get when you go down this road.
Grace, do you think the term poverty can be distorted when it's used by corporations? The example Leo just gave is one where it's not so much whether or not you can afford something compared to your direct earnings as the percentage of your earnings you're having to spend on it, which is a bit further away than what I think people would originally think.
I mean, I have really, actually, interestingly enough, mixed feelings about this. And I think my feelings are really summed up by the cartoon that's used at the top of Leo's piece, which is on the one hand a kind of indictment of consumerism and the lengths to which brands will go to convince us that we simply must have things, often things that we don't need, in order to kind of be considered legitimate human beings or to feel good about ourselves. But is on the other hand a vilification of working class people who do need those things. And I think there's something here about inequality and the impact that it has on our perceptions, and also the way that we feel about ourselves and the way that we kind of ascribe value to people. And I think on the one hand, there's this issue of perception. It's, very difficult for people like us, perhaps, who aren't struggling on a daily basis to buy the things that we need, to imagine what it would be like to live on, £257 a month, for example, which is the amount of universal credit you get as a single person under 25. I mean, just the strain of having to calculate, firstly, in the context of a housing crisis, after rent, which is something that is really non-negotiable, utilities, food, etc. Just being able to think, can I have a coffee, for example, or will that mean that I won't be able to buy food for myself and my kids, which is genuinely an issue that a lot of people face. And I think on the other hand, there's this issue that in a highly unequal society where you have people at the very, very top able to buy all these things that brands are trying to convince us that we need, and others not, you have this sense that, really in order to be considered a kind of a human being of any dignity or worth, you have to be able to buy a pair of trainers or buy this particular thing that will make people look at you in a certain way. And certainly I think for people who are in jobs where perhaps they're either ignored or treated basically with contempt a lot of the time, there is this sense that maybe by buying things, they can become, worth something. And all of those issues are complicated, and they're linked to the way that we conceive of ourselves and the way that we conceive of each other in a society that is marked by quite extreme levels of inequality at this point.
Leo, it's interesting there, Grace, talking about inequality, and obviously inequality and poverty are linked. But when we're talking about being able to purchase things from certain shops, particularly when we're looking at some of these transport examples, you could say it's more inequality than poverty. So what do you define poverty as?
Well, I mean, of course, that opens a huge debate on poverty, absolute poverty, which is destitution and the struggling for day-to-day goods of life, and relative poverty. I mean, I always think that in Monaco there must be people in relative poverty who are millionaires because they don't have a yacht or a billionaire status. So it can be terribly distorted, and I think that's one of the thrusts of my article, that how distorted the figures can be. And Grace talked about people struggling, but of course one of the points about ever widening the definition of poverty and talking about so many endless new categories of poverty, like there's even talk of smartphone poverty. If people don't have a smartphone, they're poor. Holiday poverty, bed poverty, furniture poverty. And if you widen the definition of victimhood so much, it becomes meaningless. I mean, one of the statistics that I think I mentioned in my article, was from a charity that says over 50% of Londoners suffer from hygiene poverty, which means that they can't afford basic hygiene products. And that just strikes me as an absurd assertion to make. That more than half of people in London, one of the richest cities in the world, are actually struggling to afford basic hygiene products. It doesn't make any sense.
But I think, again, this speaks to this question of inequality, because London is a very, very wealthy city, but it is also one that is...
But are you seriously saying...
very, very high levels of poverty.
Sorry, are you seriously suggesting that more than half of people in London can't afford basic hygiene products?
I wouldn't be surprised if more than half of people in London have to think very, very seriously about the decisions.
Well, we all have to think seriously about
hygiene problems.
Well,
it does matter, because it does. I mean, we know from psychological studies that just living in poverty puts an immense amount of strain. There is a cognitive load associated with thinking, right, I have this amount of income to spend each week. If I go to the end of that bit of income, I will not be able to buy certain things that I need. There's an example that's used that's, a memorable way of describing what it's like to live in poverty or on the edge of poverty is, do you live in dread of getting a toothache or your car breaking down because you just don't have the amount of money that you would need at disposable to be able to cover those costs? Or, you would have to go to maybe, your bank or even to a kind of payday loan company and pay extortionate amounts of interest just to be able to cover those unexpected costs. I would not be surprised if there was a very, very large proportion of people in our society living under those conditions.
But more than half of Londoners, one of the richest cities in the world, it doesn't really make sense. And I mean, another claim made by a different research group was that thousands of people in the UK have little or nothing to wear, when they were talking about clothing poverty. And again, that doesn't really match reality. I mean, the cost of clothing has come down by more than half over the last 30 years. We actually live in an age where clothes are incredibly cheap, and to pretend that most British people are living in debt, or thousands of British people are in absolute destitution where they have little or nothing to wear, it actually undermines the real fight against poverty by creating disillusion and cynicism with these exaggerated claims.
I think there is a genuine question here about kind of brand virtue signalling, which, and I do think that often brands will take advantage of these kinds of campaigns to be able to kind of, whether it's accrue some level of, respect amongst their consumers, or just to kind of sell more stuff. That is definitely an issue. I mean, when you talk about kind of transport and clothing, that's potentially a question here. But there's also something about why campaigners often, not just brands, feel the need to couch these questions in these terms. When you go on the news, no one wants to hear about poverty or inequality. No one wants to hear about these big, basically features of the way that we organise our economy, and, the solutions being quite transformative economic policies that would reduce inequality. They feel like very big issues that would be very, very difficult to fix. Whereas if you're a brand or a campaigner, and you go on the TV to talk about period poverty, then it feels like something, okay, I can understand what that is. And also I might be willing to, donate or to maybe condone legislation that would deal with this one specific area. So there's a question of comms and communications here that I certainly think is important. But it's also a question of, the challenges that we face in our society. As you mentioned, poverty is so high, feels so big that it's hard to get your head around it. And I think that actually requires us not to talk less about poverty and inequality, but to speak more about those issues and what we can really do at the macro level to speak to the fact that there are so many people in this country who literally cannot afford at the end of the week to make ends meet.
Grace, when we're, I suppose, leaning to Leo's point about the way poverty is bandied around by some corporations these days, we're talking about smartphone poverty, holiday poverty. Do you think that although talking about it more widely is a good thing, that does make it harder to actually address the people really in need, those in absolute poverty, if we do overuse the term?
I think certainly when it comes from brands, people have, a legitimate reason for being skeptical. But I also think often when we have these discussions, I remember when we saw this with regards to food banks, there was a lot of discussion on Twitter as to, seriously, who could actually not be able to afford food? I've put together this meal of like one egg and a piece of toast and it cost me 15p. There is this sense, I think, of a kind of distinction between, and this has always been the case in the UK, all the way back to the poor laws, the deserving and the undeserving poor. It's the kind of thing, where you go along the street and you see a homeless person and you think, I'm not going to give them money because they're just going to spend it on drugs. But your perception of that changes when you realise that, a third of young people leaving social care become homeless in the first 2 years after leaving care. And there are obviously the set of issues around mental health, physical health, abuse, poverty, substance abuse that mean that these people are actually not undeserving poor, but actually living with a whole set of very, very difficult issues that make their lives much, much harder. And that's, an extreme case. But the point does extend, I think, to poverty in general, which is that it is just hard to be poor. And it's particularly hard to be poor in a consumeristic society like ours that teaches people that if you can afford a smartphone, if you can afford a new pair of trainers, if you can afford a Range Rover, you are somewhat higher up in the social hierarchy than someone who can't.
Finally, Leo, we're talking about, and you make the argument that a lot of this bandying around of the term makes it much harder to address real poverty. So what do you think the focus should be in doing that?
Well, I think two things should happen. I think that we should be much more rigorous about the definition of poverty and challenge pressure groups and corporations that actually issue these bogus statistics, like the claim that 43% of parents of primary school children go without basic hygiene products because they can't afford it. 4 bars of soap from Aldi I found cost 59p. Is it seriously suggested that over 40% of families in Britain can't afford 59p for 4 bars of soap? So I think we've got to be far more rigorous about the definition of poverty. And also we should concentrate resources much more, which was what the last coalition government was trying to do, was concentrate resources much more on real need. And if we fall for this argument that half of Londoners are in hygiene poverty and that 80% of us are in transport poverty, we'll get absolutely nowhere. You'll just have to spray money around like graffiti on such an epic scale that you'll just have colossal waste and you'll worsen dependency and you'll heighten expectations. I think what I'm really calling for in this article is much more rigour, much more scepticism and much more challenge for the poverty campaigns who make these wild claims.
I think we just need to treat people with a basic amount of respect and dignity and really try and put ourselves in the shoes of someone who is living off a few £100s a month and imagine the toll of being forced to make the choices that they are forced to make. And rather, actually, I agree, than saying, let's tackle this bit of poverty or that bit of poverty and have a campaign and have a brand sponsoring it. Let's actually say, not just spraying money around, but think about the very structure of our society. Think about the problem of precarious work, of low wages, of the immense housing crisis that we have in this country, and actually say we need coordinated, top-down and expansive political action to tackle these challenges that make so many people's lives so hard in ways that most of us can't imagine.
Is that a call for a massive expansion in the welfare state?
More than a call for expansion in the welfare state, it's a call for the kind of democratization of ownership of resources in our society. We need to rebuild our social housing system. We need to, remove anti-union legislation that makes it hard for working people to be able to organise to demand higher wages. We need not just kind of tinkering around the edges, a little bit more tax there, a bit more spending there. We need a structural transformation of the way our society works.